Minister Enoch Gondongwana, welcome to DW News Africa. Could you give us your characterization of the debt crisis in Africa right now? What is at stake?
Let me take a step back first and say, using our presidency, we've established what is called a panel of experts for Africa. That panel of experts' focus is the debt issue. And secondly, related to it is this cost and cost of capital. Now, why is that necessary? It's because debt is a fundamental problem on the African continent. And it has been there for years. We had the HIPIC where you forget the debt and people come back. So it's a problem which undermines growth in these economies. It's also crowding out investment on social services such as education and health. People in these countries are paying more debt than paying for education and health in their own economies. So that's the extent of the crisis you have. And what compounds this matter is an absence of domestic capital. And therefore, people are forced to raise foreign capital at a huge cost.
Right.
Related to that is the fact that there's always an assumption that Africa is too risky, and therefore the cost of capital must be expensive. So those are the issues we're grappling with.
Just on that thread about why the cost of borrowing is so high, what is the reason for that, if you can expand on that? You're talking about this risk perception, but why is it that until this point we've not been able to message that the risk is more of a perception than it is reality?
That's precisely what that panel of experts has helped us, which is going to help us to message that issue. I mean, let me just give you an example now. If some rating agencies are placed that in a lower grade than countries with similar fiscal metrics than us, which reflects the bias against the African continent. That you find throughout. What the study we've done now with the African panel of experts is to begin to produce data, and it's data-driven. And among the recommendations we're placing in that is that the multinational institution must make sure that there's a data-driven kind of borrowing and lending, in a sense that you can be able to compare equals with equals on the basis of the data that's available. At the moment, irrespective of the data, there's a bias against the African continent, and therefore its cost.
So, Minister, over the years, we've seen that China has increasingly become a more sort of prominent lender to African countries. And I guess this has been a bit of an alternative in an environment where there's limited capital available to African countries, but also the capital that is available is very expensive. So we saw a lot more loans coming in from China. From where you sit, is this a good thing?
Good and bad. Good in the sense that China is able to provide and fill the gap which the developed world have created by not investing on the African continent. And China has been able, therefore, to provide the resources necessary. However, is that part of the difficulty with the Chinese staff is opaque. There's no transparency about how these loans work, and so on and so on. And therefore, there has been reluctance on their part in the debate about transparency. And secondly, because of their exposure than anybody else on the African continent, when it comes to debt relief, they become the difficult party into it. An experience we have experienced in dealing with them around the G20 common framework. Because they are exposed more than anybody else, then it makes them far difficult in the negotiations.
Right, and I think to just add some context to people who might not be aware, some Western creditors have indicated a level of willingness to forgive some of Africa's debt.
Yeah.
The condition has been that China has to do the same.
It's good to do the same.
And is it correct that the Chinese are simply refusing?
Interesting enough, we as South Africa had a Zambia's debt. Right? In the case of Zambia, it's not even the sovereign that was owed by Zambia. It's the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which is owned by the state. We had to also to take and the Development Bank had also to take a haircut. So same applies to all the institutions that were owed by Zambia, including China and the Paris Club.
Have you, as African countries, engaged the Chinese in terms of the conversation of debt relief, and what sort of resistance are you meeting from Beijing?
There's a proposal arising from the United Nations and from the African panel, and that proposal that you needed something what is called a borrowers' club, and that borrowers' club's function is to able to give voice to the borrowers, and in that sense, I think the borrowers will be able, if that materializes, will be able to engage all the lenders. And we're quite happy, raised our hand, we're quite happy to host the Borrowers Club in order to give it a voice.
Yes, and I'd like to bring you back to the question about the engagement with the Chinese on the debt relief. What have those engagements been like with Beijing?
The engagement thus far have been taking on a case-by-case basis. As I've indicated now, we were co-chairing the Zambian situation, and we're engaging with them on Zambia on a case-by-case basis. It has not been a collective endeavor to engage them.
Is there any reason for that?
I think there's not been no one has attempted to coordinate that effort. But there's also a challenge. I mean, somebody was telling me that sometimes because of our weakness, you don't want to be seen to be standing up against the big guys in case you get isolated and penalized. So I suspect that also there's a fear factor in some of these issues. But I'm saying the Borrowers Club, which is going to be a voluntary thing, is going to be a new vehicle to begin to engage the lenders.
South Africa wanted to use its G20 presidency to get relief for indebted African countries. What progress did you make in this regard? What did you achieve?
Just say, first and foremost, that we've set ourselves a difficult task, which has been difficult to achieve by any standard, by anybody. But what we've managed to achieve, which is, in my view, significant, is to get a G20 declaration on debt unanimous, a consensus on that declaration. In addition to the normal declaration, the finance minister and governor have, we've got an additional one on debt relief on the African general. The second thing we've been able to achieve is what is called engagement with Africa, which is intended to deal with also these debt issues, deal with investment and so on and so on. So we've made tremendous progress, and we've created institutions which are going to go beyond our presidents. For instance, the panel of experts, we're positioning it in such a manner that it goes beyond our presidents. The Borrowers Club is an institution which it must go beyond our presidents. So in that sense, we're creating a footprint for Africa and South Africa on that.
And yet, Minister, critics would say that there hasn't been any progress, right? They will say that the restructuring of the debt has been too slow, and that any reduction of the debt is too shallow.
Look, there's genuine criticism if you use the common framework as it stands, and which we have proposed certain changes. The common framework as it stands says, first and foremost, you must go through that program. While you are going through that program, you can't get funding from the IMF. And therefore, there's been reluctance from countries to to come through the common framework in case they get locked out of the IMF. So just genuine criticism, which we say, yes, it has been shallow, it has not been to that effect. In fact, we have been a critic of the common framework, were the ones we have raising. The IMF says to us there are about 20 countries which are in a similar position, particularly on the African continent. But few have taken the opportunity of going through the common framework, which demonstrate its pitfalls. So we accept that criticism, that there's still a battle to be fought inside the G20.
Perhaps, Minister, if we can maybe take that answer again, because you're using a lot of language that a lot of people wouldn't understand when you say common framework among your peers. I think this would make sense. But the man on the street. So I think if you just pick up on the answer to the question again about the critics saying that the restructuring has been too slow and that the debt reductions have been too shallow. Just in simple man's terms, because I think there's a lot of activism out there. People now understand that we're paying a lot of debt, we're heavily indebted, and the system isn't working for Africans. So if you're talking to somebody who broadly understands this, but maybe not the lingo of common frameworks, etc., how would you answer to critics who say it's been too slow, the restructuring, and the reduction's too shallow?
Okay, let me say, first and foremost, we agreed in the G20 on what is called an agreement called Common Framework, G20 Common Framework. That's an agreement whose intention is to facilitate debt reduction. Okay? A, it's a voluntary process for a country to come to it. B, you negotiate on a case-by-case basis. It does not have a fixed outcome. So it becomes, in that sense, more cumbersome. It takes time. It took us about 2 years to deal with the Zambian situation. So in that sense, it's a problem. So, and therefore, it's also too shallow, as you have indicated. We are urging for a different form of debt relief. First and foremost, it must not only focus on the debt, it must also focus on refinancing the existing debt on different terms. Let me just give an example. If you go to the open market and you have paid 800 basis point, and that's what you are doing in servicing your debt. But if a multinational institution comes in, refinance that debt at 300 basis point, I'm just using that as an example. What that means is that your cost of capital becomes lower. So first and foremost, that's what the panel we've created is intended to achieve, to create a negotiating environment around those things. Secondly, to create a negotiating environment against this bias that we are risky, which necessitates this higher cost of capital.
Right. Minister, while we're talking about the multinational or multilateral institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, these institutions are viewed with a lot of skepticism on the African continent. What kind of reform is needed within these institutions so that they serve Africa better?
Look, here's the challenge. We need to reform these institutions in terms of representation and so on. For instance, the IMF, we only had 2 executive directors at the whole African continent, right? Sub-Saharan Africa. 2 executive directors that sit into it. We've just made a change now. We've got a 3rd chair, which is increasing our voice into, that's one form of transformation, to increase our voice in the institution. But we also have got to do our own. In other words, we've got to manage our economies better. But you can't say you're going to resolve your problem by getting handouts without dealing. I mean, that's where I get a problem with this criticism, is that these institutions must give us handouts. We've got no obligation to sort our countries ourselves, manage them effectively. We've got to manage our economies in such a manner that we don't rely on being bailed out by these institutions. That's a key fundamental issue, and be proud of yourself as a nation is quite important. And as Africans, we've got to begin to think, how do we make sure that we move away out of that mindset, Lucifer. But the second set of issues, then we must fight this battle which makes the cost of capital for us to be expensive in such a manner that you will depend forever on borrowing.
Mr. How much of your efforts as South Africa have been undermined by the Trump administration essentially snubbing South Africa's G20 presidency? We're talking about a United States that leads the multilateral system, but is now retreating from that space. You're talking about some of the accomplishments you've made with your presidency, wanting those to run long beyond your presidency. The United States takes over the G20 presidency next year. Is all of this effort dead in the water, essentially?
I mean, the United States is an interesting country. On the finance track, we've made progress with them.
Even though they haven't been participating in it?
No, they've been participating in the finance track until the end. We just handed over, the governor was not there because I remained behind. The governor of the South African Reserve Bank handed over the presidency in the finance track to the Americans. They were inside the meeting. Right? So they have been boycotting others. For instance, the foreign minister's one, who's that guy from? He's never attended one, never sent officials. In our case, even if Scott Bizek is not there, he has been in one meeting or another, but he does send senior officials who negotiate on behalf of the American government. In that sense, we've been able, in the finance track, to construct something. Now, the challenge is the Leaders Summit, which is going to take place next week. They have taken a decision that they are not coming. They had already sent people here. As you know, with the United States of America, when a president is going to come, they look for every hotel, check venues, and so on. Taken a decision, and those people have gone back. So that's a different set of circumstances. Right. We don't know how we're going to relate with that. But from a finance, now we don't know whether the president is going to hand over to an empty seat.
Right. But I guess the Trump administration, and many people sort of predicted this, but I don't know if they would have quite gotten it, just to what extent the Trump 2.0 presidency has upended global norms, if you can put it like that. What does that mean for us here in Africa, where you have a United States that is not just so isolationist, but so aggressive as well?
Look, I mean, let me put to you in two different ways. It has been a mixed bag. There are issues with the Trump administration simply props up, like South Africa is committing genocide and so on and so on. I mean, the Nigerians are killing Christians and so on and so on. That's one set of issues. But if you look at the manner in which we're being forced along a particular way on climate change and climate finance, the Americans have kind of disrupted that path, because you were beginning to see an environment where climate change is being utilized as a trade barrier, all right? And to say, because you're producing this and that's from coal or this, therefore you will pay an extra tax. And it partly affects us because of our level of development as African continent is still, in some countries, relying on these kind of resources to develop our resources. But the American administration has disrupted that, I think, to the benefit of the developing world. They have disrupted others, like the World Health Organization, which benefits us. They have disrupted on the climate change stuff, which also is helpful to us.
Right. If we could just tie in the debt situation on the continent with inequality? Because these are both issues that South Africa has tackled in its presidency. What is the takeaway? Because the challenge is, for all our efforts, we've got to get the international community on board. And it appears in a world where there are crises everywhere, Africa's debt crisis is not a priority for anybody. So what would be the message to capitals around the world who just don't see the urgency of this?
Let me just say, what has happened, particularly since 2022, has been the reduction in what is called overseas development aid.
Right.
Precisely because it is that money that has been taken by the developed world to finance the war in Ukraine. So there's that trade-off. The money is taken off to finance the war in Ukraine. It complicates an already existing situation of debt, whose debt service cost crowd out investment on social protection, on health and education, and therefore exacerbate the poverty and hunger situation.
My final question, Minister. We talk of an Africa that, as you were saying, we have issues where we don't have enough representation. And that, of course, impacts the kind of deal that we can get, whether we're discussing climate negotiations or debt restructuring. What's it going to take? And I'm asking you this outside of the work that you've been doing now in this presidency, but for people who sit and have these conversations, who feel this is a continent that's trapped in this never-ending debt cycle, what is it going to take to liberate us, one, from this debt trap, if there is one, but also for us as a continent to secure a better deal?
Liberation is a function of unity. All the structures for liberation that have been fought on the basis of unity. The dilemma we face in the African continent is that we hardly have any unified position on any issue when it comes to interacting with the global world. They've been successful in using the divide and rule strategy. I mean, a case in point, we have Israel beating up Palestine. All of a sudden, Israel pops up as an observer in the AU. How do you see that? When we can't accept Burkina Faso on the basis that they've got a military rule. You know what I mean? It is that kind of inconsistency and which makes us vulnerable, because we can't present a united face on any issue. And that makes us, in the absence of that unity, we can't present a united front.
Minister Gondongwana, thanks very much for your time here on DW.
Thank you.